community as to what your needs are. And getting that last bit is kind of really important to us. We can't make sure we have the infrastructure in place if we don't know what you think you're going to be needing. So if you are not here for that and are just kind of camping out, you're more than welcome to stay. If you want to leave, I'm not going to be sad either. You're going to go run and hide? Is that what you're going to say? Oh. All right. So for those that do not know me, I am Andrew Grimberg. I am the systems administrator for the infrastructure. And over here is Tan Ha, also with the Linux Foundation. He is our release engineer for OpenDaylight. So if you don't know what he does, he wrangles all of you, along with George, to make sure all of our releases happen. That being said, I want to give a little overview. As I said, I know no slides as to our current design flows. Most of you have probably experienced this already. Our tool chain is Garrett to Jenkins, with Nexus kind of off on the side, collecting and distributing artifacts. If you've worked in the OpenStack community at all, you'll see a very similar design. They use Garrett and Jenkins as well. They just don't have Nexus. Nexus is there for our artifact repository. For the last year or so, we have been working inside of Rackspace's OpenStack implementation, and we've been working on top of their public cloud. That's starting to cause us some problems. We've had to get our API limits increased a couple times. We've had to get our RAM and CPU usage increased a few times, and it's getting harder and harder for us to actually do that as we're getting to be a large enough project that we're needing dedicated representatives now. So we're hitting their systems pretty hard. And with that in mind, we've been in discussion with Rackspace to move to a private cloud. What that's going to mean is over the course of Beryllium, we are going to start transitioning our current infrastructure from the public cloud that we're currently in, and we're going to start moving into a private instance of OpenStack. That's going to give us a few things that we don't currently have right now. One of the problems we've been running into is we can't easily bring in other distributions of Linux because of the way we try to limit external access into our infrastructure. Given that we're doing network testing, we don't want a public IP on any of our machines when they come up, and Rackspace in their public cloud forces that by default, and we've worked around that issue, but it causes us problems with trying to bring in other distributions than what we currently support, which is essentially Red Hat-based distributions. Moving into the private cloud, we get the full access to the full OpenStack suite of APIs, which means we actually can have the system designed as a properly offline system with a nice router in there, so we don't have to deal with all of this crap. I do mean crap. So that is our current design plan. That's where we're moving. When we start doing that, it will be sometime in the middle to late August is when you're going to start seeing us actually start pushing that way. Before we move there, we are going to be starting to upgrade our current slave infrastructure that we do have, because we are kind of behind the times at this point. We're running on CentOS 6.7, and we've got some old packages in play, and so we'll be moving up to CentOS 7. Those that are really, really wanting Ubuntu, if you can figure out how to do it with the stipulations that I can give you when you start talking to me, I would be more than happy to help you get that set up. But be aware that when we move into the private cloud, it'll be a little easier. All right. That all being said, are there questions about what we currently do?
So if I contact you, you'll send me information on what you think we need to do for Ubuntu, right?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I've had a lot of people ask over the last cycle or more for Ubuntu. I've given information as to what we need to do. Nobody's ever actually helped me work on that because I will be quite honest, I don't use Ubuntu. I have been and always will most likely be a Red Hat person. It's not because Red Hat's in the room right here. I've been using Red Hat pretty much since my inception in Linux. So I'm pretty much a diehard Red Hat person. But it's not just because of my usage there. It's because it's what the Linux Foundation actually uses generally. That is our our preferred platform just from the support standpoint. But we are willing to work with Ubuntu. We have it all over the place in our administrative architecture. It's just not in the current setup that we have right here. So we're platform agnostic when it comes to what we have to run for our customers. It's just the limitations of what we can do with what we have. Other questions? You had something?
Yeah, it's more like a request for you to explain a set of information. I know we're moving to Nodpool and talking about Nodpool. I don't have a solid understanding of it. I would love for you to talk about it.
Okay, so a little bit of information about how our dynamic system currently works. Jenkins has a plugin called JClouds, which understands multiple different cloud infrastructure APIs. It unfortunately has a major failing that once a system is initiated or destroyed, it promptly forgets about it. And the only way it knows about any instances that it is trying to manage is by taking a look in the APIs of the cloud itself and in what Jenkins currently says it has active. And unfortunately, as we've seen in the public cloud with Rackspace, we may issue a API call for a system to come up or to be shut down, and the API call either gets ignored because they're under saturation, or we're over API limits, or who knows what. And so JCloud starts trying to spin up more systems than it can, or it issues a delete, and the machine deletes out of Jenkins, but it actually doesn't delete out of Rackspace. And so we end up in these weird disconnects, and we're either oversaturated or undersaturated sometimes. That's currently what we're using. We're using that because that was what we had available to us. OpenStack has a application called Nodpool, which essentially does the same thing, but it's stateful. It knows and keeps track of everything that it does. It also has the ability to use the heap APIs, which means we can bring up clusters. JClouds can't do that. It can bring up individual slaves upon demand, according to a job saying, I need these slaves, but it can't bring up an entire cluster in one shot. Nodpool will get us that. It's got the unfortunate side effect that it can't spin down systems. It relies upon a secondary utility called Zool, which we're also talking about doing, which does pipeline and gating. But it also does destruction of the VMs. I don't know why they didn't put that in Nodpool. So we are working on moving to Nodpool. We have a couple problems with how Nodpool is configured, though. Nodpool takes a single configuration file, and since we have to bring that onto a managed system, that configuration file would end up being in our configuration management, which unfortunately, as much as most of our configuration management is moving to publicly visible thing, that file has private information. It's got API keys in it, so I can't actually release that. And there's no way for me to take what we currently do with our Vagrant definitions and Jenkins spin-up scripts that are currently available to everyone and make those directly available through Nodpool as well. So we're trying to figure out how to make what folks currently do or have the ability to do available again in Nodpool without breaking what we currently do. Back there.
Spun off, you're going to spin off. Sure. So in the earlier conversation, we were talking about, I think we were talking about Nodpool, Daniel. I think you'd brought it up, and I think Radhika might have been working on this maybe. But basically, you guys were talking about, and please, this is what I'm looking for is correction on my understanding. So you were talking about spinning off tests or kicking off tests through Jenkins, and then spinning up the nodes you need for test. Is that what we're talking about?
JClouds currently does all of that management for us. So JClouds monitors the current queue of systems that it needs, the current queue of jobs that are being requested, and those jobs all have a definition of what kind of slave they need. JClouds is monitoring for that, and we define a pool of systems. You're allowed to have X number of this particular type of system, and that's where JClouds kind of says, looks at the queue, looks at how much space it has in the Rackspace API, and determines if it can spin up another system, and it does that. It does that on the fly. It does it fairly well, generally, unless there's weird API issues. What happens then is, in the case of integration tests specifically, and right now they're the only They are the only jobs out there that currently do this. The other jobs all have the ability to do this. Nobody else is utilizing it. The integration jobs, when they come up, they have the ability to also say, I need additional slaves of this type. And they basically just enumerate all the types of slaves that they want, right? So we've got the 3-node and the 2-node and the 5-node cluster types right now defined. And what happens is JCloud sees that. The job starts, and basically the job makes a query into JClouds to say, I need these. And JClouds goes through all of its standard processes and tries to spin those up. And it takes a while. Spinning up all the VMs we currently have right now, any VM has to come up within 5 minutes. Otherwise, JClouds will throw it away and try again. So occasionally we run into problems where there's too much saturation in the pools. It'll try to spin one up. It can't. It throws it away. It'll try to spin one up. It can't. It throws it away. You add in like 15, 20 minutes as you're trying to get two extra systems online. Yeah. So that's part of the reason we're also moving from JClouds.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Do we have other questions? No.
So is the job framework is going to change right now? So we will have like new skills built or something for.
Ask into the mic. It helps you and me.
No, will there be new changes in the job files that we already created for this? Yeah.
The jobs themselves as they're created now, I don't see any primary change in the way we're currently creating jobs. Do you?
The jobs, for the most part, will be the same or similar. There will be some changes to make it point to node pool stuff.
Right. So the primary changes that will happen to the jobs themselves will be what type of slaves they need. The slave names will essentially change. So, and we will make sure that we manage the transition. So what will end up happening is we'll run JClouds and node pool concurrently until we kind of finish using JClouds. So they do work together. But they do the same job.
To keep the questions rolling, there was a talk that I didn't make it to about using host with Docker installed to stand up Docker containers for our tests earlier in the summit. Can you speak to that some and how that would interact with our CI system and such?
Okay, well, we actually have a Docker instance already available. We do have a slave that's used by the OVSDB project for doing testing against OpenStack. They stand up their OpenStack inside of a Docker instance. I think that's how they're doing it. And they do their testing there. So we have the ability already to do Docker. It's just a matter of building our slaves large enough. Right now we're capping it at an 8 gig system. That means we get 8 CPUs on the system as well. With our current implementation, we're not running DHCP on the wire. Rackspace doesn't let us do that. They get a little antsy when I say I want to run DHCP on the wire on the private network that we've set up. Partly because OpenStack, when it brings up a slave, statically assigns an address. Does it via its own DHCP mechanism, but it's actually statically assigned into the system. So Docker having access to external to box IPs is a problem. And I'm not certain how well that will work in the private one, but I know that OpenStack's got some Docker API stuff there, so we should be able to get around that too.
So I'm thinking about JJB templates and stuff. What would it look like from someone who wants to create, say, a clustering test perspective where I need 5 or 7 Docker containers to stand up inside of one VM host?
Well, at that point, it's mostly just the scripting that you put inside your job. So it would be the raw include scripts that everybody uses in their JJBs. That would be, you just have to define against the Docker APIs. You have to essentially write as if you were at the console, do X, Y, Z. And execute your tests and then tear down and clean up if you need to. Our Docker instances are designed so that when they come up, you get to run your tests. You are expected to actually clean up after yourself. We do not throw away the Docker instance right away because there may be other Docker instances that need to come in. We do that on purpose because the Docker system comes up a little slower than the others, just like the build and the merged ones. And since they're generally clean up enough behind themselves, they can live and service multiple jobs. The test jobs generally don't do that. So that's why we actually throw away the VMs on every use.
So an advantage of Docker is being able to share reusable images and build on those. What would it look like if we wanted to, say, create a base Docker image that has, you know, a cluster pre-configured, or I don't know, make something up, and then have that on like an OpenDaylight Docker Hub account and to build from or something?
We could do that, though I think we'd probably want to actually try to run our own local Docker registry, just because of the bandwidth that would be needed for constantly pulling that down. That's part of the reason that we run Nexus, not just because of we keep the artifacts local to us, but it allows us to proxy Maven Central and all these other third parties, so we're not constantly consuming a lot of external bandwidth when we're on a very high-speed network locally.
Where would we host the Docker files that create these images? Like, how does that pipeline look from like dev who wants to create a Docker file that defines an image that we want to reuse in lots of tests to it being hosted on our internal Docker?
At the present moment, we actually are using images directly out of the Docker Hub. So the process would be very similar. I don't know, do we know of any proxying Docker registries?
I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, Nexus, which we're using now, Sonatype itself actually has a bug that they've got open on creating the ability to do a hosted as well as proxied Docker registries. So eventually, we should be able to just do this directly through Nexus. But right now, we don't have that ability. As I said, we'd have to stand up our own registry right now, and there's no ability to proxy to Docker Hub and stuff like that. So what we could do is we could work with the developers. They want to develop something. They could develop it against Docker Hub, and then you'd essentially have to open a help desk ticket for asking us to import it into our registry.
Where should the Docker files that define these images live?
My opinion would be in the project repos, or if you create like a meta repo or something, kind of like packaging.
Yeah, I think we currently have Docker files in the integration project in, distributions or something like that, packages?
Yeah, in the integration packaging Docker subdirectory, there is a very simple Docker file. There's also the beginning of the ability to build an OpenDaylight Docker image in the integration packaging packer subdirectory, which is going to be a way cooler way to do it.
Okay, and we could definitely leverage all of that.
I mean, we could start with that and then have devs add additional layers of customization on top of that.
Right. Now, I was in one of the integration discussions yesterday, and there was discussion about possibly breaking some of those components out into sub-repositories of integration. So it might still make sense to keep the Docker definitions, even if they're done via Packer or something like that, inside that particular repository. And then just that way it's all centralized.
Right. Another thought though is the Docker build command supports a get URL. So in that case, your Docker file has to be in the root of that get URL. But if you create like a specialized Git repo just for that Docker file, you can make Docker builds that just point to some Git repo somewhere.
Yeah, that'd be an option too, I suppose. Though I don't think we want the explosion of repositories just for single files.
Yeah, maybe if we had Odl Forge or something where we could create really ephemeral repositories.
Odl Forge, those that are asking about
yeah,
Odl Forge.
let's talk about that too.
So we did actually get the green light from the TSC in January to create Odl Forge. For those that don't know what Odl Forge is, the intent behind it is essentially the OpenDaylight CI infrastructure light. You basically would be able to come to Odl Forge and request resources for a project that doesn't have to go through TSC review. We did actually start working on building out that infrastructure, but then we started running into issues with rack space. Not problems with rack space itself, just our usage of rack space. And for most of Lithium, we were essentially doing a lot of firefighting, honestly. And then the Linux Foundation itself, we run a lot of collaborative projects, of which I am in charge of our Puppet infrastructure internally for a lot of that. And so we've actually decided to basically rebuild our Puppet infrastructure from the ground up. And we did not take that particular step lightly. but we realized that so many of our collaborative projects, of which OpenDaylight is one of, have been requesting the definitions of how we manage the environments, and we haven't been able to provide that redesigning our Puppet in such a way that we could make that available to the rest of the community was actually kind of more of a priority than trying to stand up another environment. Odl Forge, the work that I did on Odl Forge before we kind of switched tracks, informed a lot of what that is looking like. And so what happens is when we finally get that to a point where it's usable, Odl Forge will kind of come up almost on its own. And so I can't guarantee that it will be online by the end of year or by the end of Beryllium even, but it is a target for me to essentially have that available. It will most likely come up inside the private cloud that we bring up. So it's going to be partly contingent on that and partly contingent on the Puppet work that we're doing now. More questions? We've got 23 minutes.
What are you most excited about in the Beryllium release cycle with regard to CI?
No, what was the question again?
What are you most excited about in the Beryllium release cycle with regard to CI?
I would say that I'm most excited about the ability to, A, move into the private cloud so we have better control of things, B, give everybody the access to build images that they actually want to use, instead of saying, this is your blessed image by IT. I know that that's a bit of a issue for folks because of how slow we are about getting those built. We tried very hard to improve that this cycle. I see that when we move into the private cloud, it will work better for us. And I also see the ability of moving to the private cloud to actually grant people their own private localized clouds for interns and for others that need to do project work that may be long-lived. We'll be able to do that a little easier too. I'm going to be working with Rackspace to see what we can do about somehow integrating our OpenDaylight identities into the private cloud identity system. I'm not certain how well we can do that. That may not happen. We may have to issue separate accounts, but. What do folks actually want to see from our CI? What are we not currently doing for you that you think that we need to do for you?
I'm trying to let other people answer.
I guess it would be finding a good build. For my sake, I'm a tester, and so I do have to do a lot of combing through things to find the correct build to test with. Sometimes I'm testing a feature build, so I'll go in through those tabs and find the feature, and then I'll start scouring and looking for a good build. And by the time I find a good build, even though it says green, 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 I'll be 5 builds into it, into testing. So I think maybe and I know we talked about this yesterday, there was maybe a better process, maybe a better promotion, I don't know.
That kind of comes to a couple different ideas. Colin just had a discussion not too long ago about how we might have projects actually working with not depending so much directly on master. That's part of the problem that you're running into, is that all of our projects currently during development depend upon the master of whatever they depend upon. And that's generally rapidly changing. And by the time your Leaf project that you're testing actually acquires when you are doing your testing specifically, the revisions you may see or may not be the exact ones that your project, when they release their artifacts, tested against. So there is discussion around how we can make that both slower and easier at the same time. And we don't want it to be too slow. We don't want it to be too fast, obviously. The other is we've had discussions around doing continuous release. And that would be one of those projects we have to work from the Leaf in. This other option is, we're not certain exactly where we would work on this one. It could work from the Leaf in or kind of from different locations out. But in both cases, they would help stabilize that environment some. And we're still trying to figure out how it would work well. One of the things that we're possibly going to look into is how we can utilize the staging repository system of Nexus better to do some of what you're doing, to say, here's the snapshot of what I tested, and pass that to other tests so that you can actually continue working with that specific snapshot instead of going, okay, this passed, but by the time your tests start, new artifacts may exist. And that's basically what you're running into. That's exactly what you're running into. Okay.
Exactly.
So we are not currently leveraging the staging system of Nexus to its fullest. We're only utilizing it right now for the automatic builds of the SRs.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Others? What are your pain points? I know you've got to have pain points. Come on, folks. This is your bitch section. Come on.
Okay, so on top of Carmen's question, so in Robot you can define tags for particular tests. So in the case of his question, so what is like the OK version of your distribution? It's a different notion for depending on which kind of stack you have on OpenDaylight, right? So depending on whatever you're using, then this is okay or not is a different kind of thing. So for level 0 purposes, or for offset 0 purposes, pretty much is the test that we do as many as possible, multiple times, and then it's more stable like OpenFlow plugin or any of the most tested ones. But I think maybe we should have on Jenkins a structure that you have specific builds that you can define the tags that you want to execute, then will actually run some tests that you have on premise. Then once you have that validated, or you can just grab those bits and start testing. Because I'm not seeing today, the way that it is today, a way of escaping from having our own downstream version that we compile and give to our test teams internally, unless you have this release cycle, like constant release cycle all the time. I don't know if my question is very clear, but how do we avoid like having like blessed versions internally instead of having some kind of mechanism that you can go there and I want to run a particular set of tests that is not part of the whole battery, but as a specific set of tags that I want to execute just in my robot side to guarantee that I know that everything is working on OpenFlow plugin, basic services and everything, plus those sets of tags that I want to execute and guarantee that my feature is working end to end on the stack that I currently testing, right? Because in the case of HP, for instance, we have some specific service that we're expecting to be there running by the time we run OpenDaylight, the OpenDaylight distribution. But for other companies, it's different. It's different stack, different projects, and so I don't know how we can do that. Like for custom distributions, I want to have my own like robot, like my own Jenkins job, customize it that runs some tags. And just verify if that guy's green or not.
Are you Are you asking for this for your internal Jenkins system, or are you asking this for
yeah,
our
so the model that we have today is like you have your own internal Jenkins distribution, right? But I was thinking like in terms of adoption, sometimes for certain customers, knowing that their particular HP switches or Cisco switches or whatever switches or whatever vendor, knowing that there's a public version of the Jenkins job that verifies against those, basically some core tests is pretty good actually. Instead of going to the multi-vendor and verify, it's difficult to keep track of which version it is.
So one of the things that we have available, but nobody's been using it at all, is we do have the ability for Garrett itself to be able to trigger tests in third-party Jenkins. Mm-hmm. So nobody has actually come to us asking for essentially the API access for that. That would allow people to, vendors to make sure that the tests that are going, the patches that are going in don't break against their specific infrastructure, mm-hmm. right? So HP testing against HP, Cisco testing against Cisco. We don't have any of this hardware. We are not running a hardware test lab.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So we are relying on the third parties to actually do that specifically for themselves. So it's possible to trigger on the jobs that we currently have, or the Garrett changes, right? The question you probably are having is how do we trigger test suites after things? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
You could do that internally still. It is possible for Jenkins to actually monitor other URLs, so you could monitor other jobs in our Jenkins directly via an XML path. And if that changes, new version, success, then you can run your own test suite. You would be able to pull the information from Jenkins that way and do your own tests. It would not be that difficult to do that. We're more than happy to help you try and do that. I can't guarantee that we can work directly on your system, obviously. We're not going to do that. But we would be more than happy to help you set that up.
Cool. Thanks.
Anyone else? Okay.
This is a question.
You're on.
Yeah. When we tried to add something for VTN coordinator, I faced a lot of trouble to know which file to modify. In Relinch Builder, I didn't know which file to modify. Once this package is installed, we were unable to identify the right file, because I want something installed in this Mininet VM, or I want something installed in some other VM. So I didn't know which file. Bootstrap files. I think, yeah, there was some confusion.
Okay, you're talking back to the current disconnect we have between how our images are created, how they're spun up, and how the integration jobs actually talk with them, right?
Yeah.
And that is definitely an issue that we have right now. So we have, for those that don't know, our current base slave images are created via Vagrant definitions. Those Vagrant definitions live inside of the Relinch Builder project under Vagrant directory structure. And it's done in a layered fashion. So the question that a lot of people start asking me when they look at the Vagrant stuff is what Vagrant actually is doing which, right? We have a wiki page specifically dedicated to how the JJB system and our slaves actually operate. There is a table in there that specifies every single slave type we have by name, by pool. It also states exactly which Vagrant file, finalized file, actually causes that image to be instantiated. It also talks about which Jenkins scripts, which are fired when the slave starts, fire off. Between those couple of components, that's how you can basically modify the slaves that we currently have. Vagrant, getting a new slave instance in play right now still is a bit of an issue, because we have to do it in a layered fashion and take snapshots and then add it to Jenkins. There's no way we can do this all via the APIs right now. We can't just do somebody modified our Vagrant file, go build this automated fashion thing. It would take a lot more tooling than we've had the ability to, time to put into it. It's possible, it's just difficult for us. We should be able to get closer to that with the private cloud. I can't guarantee that we will, but we should be able to get closer to it. But to answer your question specifically, where would I put XYZ? It really depends upon what XYZ is. So if that particular thing is something that needs to live on an image at a specific revision at all times, and it takes a long time to start or to be installed, say you're actually having to build something on the box, that needs to go into the slave definition itself and needs to be baked into the slave. It's not easily changeable. If it's something that can be easily installed and can be installed in under 5 minutes, that can move into the Jenkins scripts. So what happens is when the slave starts up, once that slave is available to Jenkins on the wire, Jenkins logs in and it actually executes a series of scripts. And that's how those packages get installed. If it's something that needs to be mutable regularly, that needs to live inside the integration jobs themselves. And so it will extend your job time just based upon that, because if you're having to install software through robot, it's going to take time, and that's going to be it's going to add to your testing. Does that kind of answer your question, or is it not clear enough yet?
What happened is I did some change to bootstrap.sh, if I remember right, and the next VM that it spun, it did not have that. So I was trying to add a new compiler for this new application that we are adding to VTN project. then later I think somebody worked on, they said I'm respinning all the VMs so that you
Oh
have
yeah,
the-
so when you add things to the bootstrapping files in the Vagrant definitions, that becomes a manual process. So when we merge those changes into Garrett right now, I myself end up going in and having to go through the process of recreating a slave. The reason is we have to go through a series of different steps to do that. We use that Vagrant file that you basically gave us. We update the slave images, and then we have to actually update Jenkins itself. So there's a process in this, and it can take, the fastest I've managed to do it is in about 6 hours. And the slowest has been about a week because I ended up having problems with Rackspace not spinning up a slave properly for me. Okay, we've got 9 minutes, or actually a little less than that. Any other questions, concerns, desires? Daniel, you're just making this like the Daniel and Andy show.
I mean, I could just do this the whole time, right? No one else, seriously, if someone else has one, take it from me. So during some of our integration talks over the last couple of days, there was a understanding that propagated down from the board to the TSC to us around our focus on creating stable features during the next release cycle and wanting to do some different testing around those. And so the TLDR version of it is that there's this subset of features that are going to be marked as stable, and we want to execute test just with those features installed. And then there's the normal thing that has all of the extra features and all the stable features, and we want to also test all of that. So basically that amounts to increasing our testing overhead by the percentage of tests that are run against stable features. So I guess I'm raising that as a concern, and I've encouraged Lewis to punt back up to the board and ask for more infrastructure. But it seems like we're going to
I'm going to state this right now. In my discussions with Rackspace, I basically said, I asked them to look at their information as to our usage over the past 6 months or so, right? So the infrastructure that they are initially building out for us when we actually finally pull the trigger on this is going to essentially look a lot like what we would need to have dealt with to finish off lithium. Now, I know that seems rather small, considering that you're talking about the fact that we need to increase resources, but we need to start somewhere, because moving into the private cloud is actually going to require that Rackspace acquire hardware, and we're essentially leasing hardware from them, and their admin time to admin OpenStack, so we're not having to do that. But what that gets us is that once we have that infrastructure in place, since we are not currently utilizing the infrastructure at that capacity right now, we will be able to grow it out, and Rackspace is very much about making sure that we have the capacity we need, and they're very proactive about that already. So yes, we should be able to have the capacity. We may start running into issues with money if the board doesn't want to increase our funding for infrastructure, but I don't know if that's going to be a problem, because they keep saying every time I say we need more stuff, they say, okay.
Yeah, it's kind of a causal relationship, though. If they want this, if they're going to ask for this stable feature additional testing, then, I mean, you can't ignore that requires a significant percentage more resources.
Exactly. So I don't see that it's going to be a problem, or I don't foresee it being a problem, but if it is, it's more a matter of we are growing so fast that Rackspace can't build out the infrastructure for us.
Cool.
We will have the ability to burst into their public cloud, but then we run into some of the restrictions we currently have.
Good. That clarified the concern.
You're walking in at the end there, Lewis. All right. Are there any other questions, concerns, desires, heartaches? No? Okay. Then I will give you back about 5.5 minutes of your time.